Hello and welcome back to the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. We're just about done now, and I've got to admit that it's been a pretty crazy, pretty hectic ride. I've watched a lot of films, and I've been pumping out these videos as quickly as I can. And so, after taking a look at a couple of anthologies in the last few days, and seeing as how we've pretty much looked at most of the big Felissa Rose films so far, I was kind of trying to think what would make a good kind of end-of-term closer for this month. So, well, you can see what I've done. The thing that really decided it for me was going back and watching Under Surveillance a couple of days ago, because I really enjoyed it, and that kind of got me thinking once more about Caesar and Otto, who were the strangely old-fashioned comedy duo dreamt up by Mr Dave Campfield, director of Under Surveillance, and I thought that after we've had quite a bit of kind of try-hard, nasty edgelord stuff, it would be a nice way to celebrate by just kicking it back with something that's really nice and chill and having a look at the other two Caesar and Otto films following on from Caesar and Otto's Summer Camp Massacre that I spoke about way back at the start of the month. Now, the weird thing is that when I was talking about Summer Camp Massacre, I remember saying that I thought it would be a cool idea if they released a Caesar and Otto box set. If you remember me saying that, then you might even be one step ahead of me. There is actually, if not a box set per se, a DVD that's got all three Caesar and Otto films on it, which I picked up in just enough time to give these other two films a spin. The thing that put me off is the fact that the packaging has undergone this really weird, sinister Orwellian bit of censoring, whereby they've carefully removed all mention of Caesar and Otto from the cover, so that you're not buying a set of all three Caesar and Otto films, but you're actually picking up something that's called the Holiday Horrors Triple Feature DVD. It's a little bit of a shame that they're not prouder of what they actually are. I mean, I don't blame the filmmakers for this at all. This is clearly a distributor's move, and it's a shame that Caesar and Otto themselves have been binned from the marketing in favour of just kind of generic seasonal horror imagery. It's that thing that I've spoken about before where a lot of low-budget marketing does seem to just genuinely involve trying to trick punters into buying something that they don't actually want. I mean, at the end of the day, these are three Caesar and Otto films. No matter how ashamed of that fact the DVD company was, the only reason you'd take their names off the cover is because you don't have faith in the product itself for what it is, and if that's the case, then why do you think lying to your customers is going to help your sales any? It's really mystifying to me, all this stuff, and to be honest, it's more than a little bit sad. If you don't think that Caesar and Otto are a marketable duo, then why bother sticking out a set of their films? But let's talk about the films themselves, because after all, that's why we're here. So we've got two films here, the first of which is Caesar and Otto's Deadly Christmas from 2013. Both films have got quite a lot in common because they both feature our lovable half-brothers Caesar and Otto doing their comedy shtick and repeating certain routines. Both films have also got quite loose plots and tend to just kind of bounce about from one silly set piece to the next, sort of pinballing from one lame gag to the next. Not that I necessarily think that that's a bad thing, it's worth pointing out. I think that before you even sit down to watch a Caesar and Otto film, you've got to start off from the basic premise that they are pretty feeble and they've got a kind of flimsy but good-natured cartoony feel to a lot of what's going on. I think the first thing that you really notice about Deadly Christmas is that the quality of the film itself is much sharper and more polished looking when compared to the previous one, the Summer Camp Massacre of a few years previously. I think the direction is faster paced and more kind of stylised in that slightly comic-y kind of way, and it's just generally a slicker production all round, although yeah, of course, it still does look fairly cheap, but there are definitely fun little flourishes along the way. I don't think I've actually taken the time to point this out just now, but very quickly, Caesar and Otto are this pair of half-brothers. Caesar, played by writer and director of the film Dave Campfield, is this kind of slightly neurotic, egomaniacal failed actor. He's full of self-importance, and he lives with his lovable big lug of a half-brother, Otto, who just kind of dosses about getting into trouble. They are a balanced duo, but I can't help but think that Caesar always seems to be such a cunt to Otto all the time, often when he doesn't deserve it. And it's quite rare that he actually ever gets any kind of comeuppance, which means that you end up with that kind of Abbott and Costello thing where there's very much a straight man and a stooge, and I always feel kind of sorry for Otto just because he never really feels like he deserves with being stuck with such a dickhead for a brother, and because he's very much a likeable put-upon character who hasn't got an unlikable bone in his body. But that's the basic setup, and they turn their hand to whatever. In the case of Deadly Christmas, what we've got is a spoof on the Christmas slasher films with a lot of kind of knowing in-jokes thrown at the Silent Night, Deadly Night films. The thing is that because of the kind of level of ultra-silliness of these films, you get less clever little nods than you do just kind of out-and-out exact rip-offs from the classics that it's mocking, to the point where they actually start mentioning the films that they're ripping off by name whilst they're ripping them off, which is either really clever or just really lazy, and it's up to you which. Like in Summer Camp Massacre, we get a fun casting coup which this time is our friend Linnea Quigley, who gets the chance to riff on her famous Silent Night, Deadly Night death scene. And again, it's not so much a clever little joke for the fans as just pointing at someone famous and asking them to do that thing, but at least Linnea Quigley, like Felissa Rose in Summer Camp Massacre, is up for having a laugh at herself and is somebody that's very grounded and self-aware of her own kind of legacy within the horror community. Linnea Quigley seems like a really sound, decent person, and I've always had a lot of time for her, and not just because she was in a Caesar and Otto film. I mean, as with anything like this that's kind of patchy and consists of a series of goofy little sketches joined together by a very loose plot, talking about this film is basically me telling you jokes that I found funny in it, and spoiling its best bits, which, as I think I've already explained, is not the way to do this. The only other thing that I'll mention, just because I think it's quite fun, is that Lloyd Kaufman, the head cheese of my beloved trauma films, gets to basically do a spoof version of the famous grandfather scene from the start of Silent Night, Deadly Night, which I think works nicely, although it's less of a spoof again and more just a photocopy of that scene that somebody's drawn the dialogue equivalent of a pair of comedy tits over. Quite a lot of the Caesar and Otto formula does rely on copying scenes that horror fans will be able to recognise. Now the thing is, I've never been the biggest fan of that way of doing things, because I think just really basic fan service like this isn't enough to really sustain a film, and being able to go, hey, they're riffing on Silent Night, Deadly Night too, isn't really a substitute for actually writing decent jokes in the first place. I think what it all really comes down to is the fact that at the end of the day, I do like these two characters because they're just your really basic, good-natured idiots. There's so many really nasty, lowest common denominator horror comedies out there that it's nice to see somebody trying to make something that's not trying to gross you out to get cheap laughs. It's very hard to hate Caesar and Otto because they've got a nice, goofy, open, childlike quality to them. In fact, if it weren't for a few little moments of gore, I'd say that the Caesar and Otto films would actually work well for a younger audience, and again, I don't mean that in any way as an insult. Some of my favourite horror comedies of all time are ones that actually work for an audience of any age. Thinking about it, I'd actually say that Deadly Christmas is probably the best of the three Caesar and Otto films because it's got the most focused storyline, which means that it feels less like a series of random sketches and actually has got a bit of pace to it. Weirdly, we also get an unusually large part for Mr Felissa Rose aka Darren Miller, who plays the main killer Santa villain here, as well as basically a tiny cameo from Felissa herself, who plays, weirdly, her real-life husband's wife, except she's playing it in a really caricatured and over-the-top way. It's Felissa Rose's smallest role in any of these three films, but it's still a lot of fun. I think I could probably give Caesar and Otto's Deadly Christmas a 5 out of 10. Like I said, even though I had fun with it, it is very feeble, and the jokes kind of vary between stuff that's funny because it's meant to be, stuff that's funny because it's self-aware about how bad it is, stuff that's funny because it's so feeble, and stuff that just doesn't land at all. It is very low budget, but it is pretty entertaining all told. So yeah, a 5 out of 10 for Caesar and Otto's Deadly Christmas. I mean, objectively, it would be lower than that, but you know what? I'm rating for enjoyment, and I had a totally fine time with it. Not that much of a recommendation, I know, but hey, at least I'm being honest. I respect Dave Campfield a lot, but comedy is hard to do, you know? Especially stuff that's deliberately avoiding that lowest common denominator. So now we jump forward a few years and come to Caesar and Otto's Paranormal Halloween, which I believe is the last time that we've seen these two together, although without wanting to spoil anything, the film does end with the promise of another installment. Not sure if or when that's going to materialise. I mean, I definitely watch it. Even though they're not great, I do actually quite like watching these Caesar and Otto films. Now this is a more straightforward hodgepodge of several different kind of spoofs of various horror films. More like a linear version of one of the later Scary Movie films, where we start off with some quite cool Halloween pastiching, before we then head into kind of haunted house, poltergeist, Amityville horror territory, and then we end up at Paranormal Activity. I think because this is a lot more scattershot than the previous two films, which were more focused on one particular type of slasher film, that meant that they could have fun with the tropes of those subgenres, Paranormal Halloween is more of just a basic series of random spoofs, some of which work, some of which don't. But because there's less of a structure, the set-piece gags kind of stand on their own more because there isn't that safety net of a clearly established plot to fall back on. It's also quite weird, thinking about it. I know that doing spoofs of Sleepaway Camp and Silent Night, Deadly Night aren't exactly topical satire, but it feels kind of weird that this film takes the time to riff on the success of the Paranormal Activity films so much, considering that those films had pretty much been and gone by this stage. The reason I bring this up is because the gags in the Paranormal Activity section of this film are less loving homages and more just kind of naked swipes at the whole found footage subgenre as a whole. Maybe this was just something that Dave Campfield himself had trouble with, I don't really know, but they do feel a little bit bare as satire, a little bit too vitriolic to be honest, although I imagine a lot of the audience probably feel the same way. Maybe I just feel that having a go at found footage films is kind of an easy target. We've got a guest appearance from our good friend Tiffany Shepis in this one, as Caesar and Otto's new neighbour, and for a change, we get a nice part for Felissa Rose, who this time plays a Lorraine Warren imitation, doing the husband and wife routine from The Conjuring, which we see and smile knowingly at, before somebody then says,
"So you're like the husband and wife team from The Conjuring."
Well, for copyright purposes, I'm gonna say no.
Is that really stupid, or is that really clever? You decide. But Paranormal Halloween is still quite fun, although I'd probably say it's the least of the three films, just because it's a little bit too arch in places. There is a whole thing about Caesar writing a horror film that allows for a lot of pretty basic meta gags, including a very long one about the benefits of putting TNA in your film to help sell it. The joke is that Caesar sticks to his principles and refuses to include gratuitous boob shots to make his horror film sell, all whilst the camera stares at a woman in a bikini. It's that gag again of lampshading your silliness that sometimes gets a chuckle and sometimes gets a groan. There's a few quite decent gags this time around, but it feels a little bit more disjointed, a little bit more openly spoofy and winky at the camera-y, instead of just being open and silly and goofy in that endearingly childish way that makes this all feel like a live-action cartoon. I think I'd probably give Caesar and Otto's Paranormal Halloween a 4 out of 10. It's pretty fun, it's got some nice big obvious horror in-jokes in it, it's amiable, it's daft, it's fairly warm-hearted. It's just that this one feels a little bit shallower than the others, and there isn't really quite the same level of rapport between the brothers this time. All in all though, I would say that you owe it yourself to at least give Caesar and Otto a go, because you never know, you might find that their blend of lovable goofery just clicks with you. I would really love to have rated the films higher, but the truth is that they're really not amazing, but just right for something like a lazy, kind of silly Sunday afternoon when you fancy watching something you can just relax into and have a fun time with. And that should do us for day number 30 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, our last couple of new reviews for the month of October. And I think that it's a nice, silly, end-of-termy way to go out for now, because Felissa Rose has always been somebody that I feel makes sure that she's having fun with what she's doing, working with people she likes over and over again, and generally just having a good time. And I think that the Caesar and Otto films really show this to be the case. And so, the question is, why am I stopping now? Well, of course, I'm not actually stopping, but instead, what I'm going to do is to cap things off with a very special episode tomorrow, where I'll be kind of summing the whole month up, and hopefully it's going to be a lot of fun. But more importantly, what I'm going to be doing tomorrow is that I'm going to be counting down my personal top 10 favourite Felissa Rose performances to give you the short list of what I think are the essential films to watch for Felissa Rose fans, to give you a chance to catch up on the best of her acting. I think that a top 10 video is a nice way to finish things off, and it will mean that as well as several hours of rambling bollocks that we've had over the last few weeks, you'll actually have something to take home at the end of the month, this handy dandy rundown of the essential top 10 Felissa Rose performances. I know that, speaking personally, horror fans really do love a good list, and hopefully this will be a really interesting one, just because I think that Felissa Rose's filmography is so wide and so varied, and it covers so many different types of films. But hopefully you've enjoyed this one, day number 30 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, a cheeky little Caesar and Otto special. So please join me for that one tomorrow, where we will be counting down the top 10 Felissa Rose performances for the very last instalment of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. And if there's one video that I really want you to watch, then it's going to be that one. So don't let me down, okay? And I will see you in the next one.